Hi, and welcome back to the History Hut. I'm Jim. This is Dr. K, and we continue our discussion on religion in India. And you mentioned the Islamic invaders in about the 8th century before. What did they think of the Hindu?
Well, of course, this is a huge issue, and I mentioned that the Islamic raids were actually very harsh and intolerant, but of course they stay on as rulers. The problems are, and I'll just kind of list them, what a Hindu would believe in, what a Muslim would believe in, and you can see what the differences are. So for Muslims, there's only one God, Allah, and it seemed to them that the Hindus worshipped many gods. So that's a massive, massive issue. That
Which, of course, isn't really the case.
But yeah. So for also for Muslims, there's no priestly class. Remember, you don't have priests, and for Hindus, of course, you do. You have the top caste is the Brahmin priests, so there's that. Muslims ate beef but no wine, and Hindus didn't eat beef because the cow is sacred, but they drank wine, so that's an issue too. And then it becomes a cultural thing, like, oh, if you eat beef, then the cow is even more sacred than it was before. For art, Muslims, of course, abstract art in the mosques and no representations of either Allah or the Prophet Muhammad. And for Hindus, erotic art, sexually frank art, sexually frank impressions in stone or in sculptures of gods, manifestations of different gods. So that's a big problem as well. Just the same thing. No representation. Well, no kind of sexually frank representations, I think, in Islamic art as well, but very, very much the case in Hindu art. In language, the Quran accessible to everybody, Arabic. But language in the language of the faith is obscure. It's Sanskrit, and it's controlled by the top caste, by the Brahmin priests. So that's another big difference. And then, of course, for Muslims, you have paradise, or the underworld or hell after Judgment Day. And for Hindus, this never happens. You get the transmigration of souls from one body to another and the kind of continued cycle of rebirth. Both of them have mystics, the Sufi and the Bhakti, but that's probably the only common ground. Mm-hmm. Another huge difference was in society. There's no real class distinction in terms of justice or the faith in the Islamic world. And of course, the Hindu had a strict class system called by the Portuguese the caste system that applied to every single aspect of people's daily life. So very, very different, and this is probably the reason why the invaders just can't settle to this new faith or deal with it at all.
What do you mean when you say that the caste system applied to all aspects of life?
Well, the caste system, it's also called varna and seems to have something to do with color, but it's the Portuguese that first call it the caste, or they call it casta, meaning lineage or race. And by the time you get to, say, the time of the Mughal Empire, so the 16th century, it's become really rigid, a really rigid system, and you can't move up and down in it. But it looks as though at some point in its early stages, there was maybe a possibility to shift about a bit, but still after contact with Europeans, and not that that's important, but after contact with Europeans and even with the Islamic world, it's seen as repressive and backwards by outsiders. Because you couldn't eat with another caste. So if you were an outsider, if you were, say, you were a British diplomat, or you were Islamic, you couldn't eat with any of the other castes, and the caste couldn't eat, like a Brahmin couldn't eat with a Vaishya. So it was seen as a bit of kind of social engineering. And this, of course, we know that the British engaged in that too, but this just wasn't seen as in a positive way at all. Although for Indian history, it's seen as a real stabilizer, because people kind of knew their place and they knew their duties, caste by caste. But it's interesting though, because nobody would want to help someone from a lower caste rise to a higher caste. Why not? Because he's in that caste because of previous actions in a previous life. So it's not, so if you're a Dalit, if you're an untouchable, you're there because you've done something bad in your previous life and you've been reincarnated into this. So there would be, why would I help you? Why would I want you to move up? All you can do is try and be a really good person in that caste, and in your next life you'll move up. So that's a really different thing about it as well. So you just have to hope for a better life at the next reincarnation. So but Indian historians say, well, there's no social upheavals because if you believe that you deserve the status that you're born into, then you're not going to rebel against it, and you have this hope that if you do a good job at this, that things, you know, lead a good life and you won't get this one next time around. Over time, though, as with many things, it becomes an indicator of levels of purity or pollution, and it means really that inequalities in the system are just, you know, legitimized and become irreversible. So you're born an untouchable, too bad, buddy, you're going to stay an untouchable, and there's not much you can do about it. And of course, again, it leads to unequal access to things like jobs, because there are specific jobs that each caste does, so you couldn't change to another job. And educational opportunities, of course, restricted. And at the bottom, you have the outcasts, so the untouchables, and they have to live outside the village. They're not allowed to eat or touch the same food as people from the castes above them. And I think I mentioned before that even the shadow cast by an untouchable can pollute someone from another caste. So it's at its best, it's a set of obligations in a social hierarchy where each level has to follow a specific dharma, and everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing, and you just try and do a really good job at it. And it appears to come from the Aryan period, because the Aryans divided people into 4 classes: the Brahmins at the top, and they're the purest, of course, and they're the priests, the priestly caste, and then the Kshatriya, they're the strongest. They're the soldiers and administrators, and then the Vaishya, who are the producers or the traders, and they're supposed to be practical and intelligent. And then the one that comes in last is the Shudra, or the Sudra, people of lower intelligence who lack initiative, and they become the workers and the servants. And the Rig Veda says that the originator of the universe decided all of this. And if you were to look at a body, the Brahmin was his mouth, his arms were the Kshatriya, his thighs were the Vaishya, and his feet were the Shudra. And then at the very bottom, of course, you have the untouchables, who are also known as the Dalits, the outcasts, the Chandalas. And caste discrimination technically ended at the time of India's independence, but the reality is quite different. One of the only ways that you could get out of the caste system is actually by converting to a faith that doesn't recognize it, like Buddhism or Christianity. The Sikh don't recognize the caste system either. India's constitution forbids negative discrimination. So in the modern period, so this is something we're talking about from the period of the Aryans, 1500 BC, all the way up to now, like this year. So the constitution forbids negative discrimination based on caste in favor of positive discrimination, but that's only been since about the year 2000. Still, it's very difficult. I was watching a little documentary about kids who were at university, and they were in just a university history class, and the prof said, okay, I'd just like to find out, what caste everyone's in. Put your hand up if you're a Brahmin. And of course, like, the Brahmins put their hands up, and then nobody else in the and they talked to the students afterwards. They were really insulted because you don't want people to know what caste you belong to. Mm-hmm. Just to give you an example for the modern period, in the early 1990s, 16% of the population, or 138 million people in India, were considered untouchables, so still in that bottom caste. But now, with that positive discrimination, I suppose it's a bit helpful. 15% of government jobs and 15% of spots at the university are held for them.
Do they still have to knock a bit of wood when they...
No, that would be terrible. In 1961, untouchables had a 10% literacy rate, and in 1981 they had a 21% literacy rate, and then they stopped keeping those kinds of stats, so we have no idea what the literacy rate is now. But besides the untouchables, there are also people called the scheduled tribes. And the scheduled tribes are indigenous people. Remember, we talked about the darker skinned people that are pushed down to the south, but indigenous people who never accepted the caste system and who live in jungles and in the mountains and don't have much to do with the outside world. And they make up almost 8% of the population. And then there's another group called the backward classes, and they make up 50% of the Indian population now. And that includes the Shudras and the untouchables who have converted to other faiths. And now people in the higher castes feel that they're being discriminated against because, you know, they don't get all the top stuff anymore. Mm-hmm. Now, just a little thing, because one of my favorite journals is The Economist, and so I'm always reading that. In The Economist on June 12, 2010, there was an article about the caste system, and it says 60 years after India's constitution banned caste discrimination, the top castes still have a tight grip. There are still honour killings. Dating sites go by caste, and you can actually look those up. It's kind of cute. And India was deciding whether or not to count caste in its upcoming census. That was of 2010. And but The Economist said that the new economy in India has done more to make India caste blind than anything else in any kind of legislation. But that was in January. And then in December 18th, 2010, there was an article called A Village in a Million. And it was about Shahabpur, a small village. And it tells the story of a man of 45 who cures and sells skins, a hereditary job. So he's an untouchable. And his wife's a midwife. And that's also seen as an unclean and task that's to be despised. And they've only been in this village 2 decades, so they're still seen as outsiders. And it talks about the village of 10,000 being arranged by caste and how untouchables are often abused in the village. They're the poorest and they're routinely bullied and beaten. And people from other castes just feel that it's perfectly okay to come onto the little bit of land they have and to take stuff off their trees and, you know, just kind of, you know, do whatever they want. And it says also in the article, for a few rupees or a handful of rice, Muslims and Hindu men demand and can have sex with the untouchable women in the village. They line up to do this, and this man's wife is a kind of victim of that. And he said it was good because when she stopped being so pretty, then they stopped, they stopped coming. So, you know, in the modern world, that just seems terrible. And it also went on to say that castes were separated by walkways and ditches. And although it got a lot better than it had been, you still, you know, see these kinds of things. Very little intermarriage. And then there was just a little follow-up again, October 22nd, 2011. A study of 10 states found that untouchable children, Dalit children, were fed separately at a number of rural schools, and that poverty, infant mortality, illiteracy are worse than for the average Indian child. But it ended up praising the rise of, and this is interesting, caste-neutral jobs like pizza delivery men. So there you go. So, you know, something that's still with us today, and it has to do, if you're the untouchables, those are people that work with animal skins, anything that has to do with death and skins and tanning and cleaning and anything kind of also considered impure. And you know, you think, well, one of the ways that you could get around that would maybe be to move to the city, which people are doing by the millions. And I was reading an article that said that, yes, that may look like a solution, but when it comes to the point where you actually want to marry somebody, the first thing the family will do will say, I want to know where you're from, what village you're from, and know everything about you. And it was saying on that for dating, this guy was saying, well, you know, I go on the dating sites and it's okay. It's okay to marry another caste now. My parents weren't all that upset, but if I'd brought a Dalit home, well, that would have been game over. Like, that's just still not done. So very difficult to escape that kind of thing. So seen, you know, outside India in a really negative way, but had an original function that was probably a great stabilizing force. But then because it's tied up with religion and because it's tied up with reincarnation, then why would you want to change the system and help somebody move out of that system if you think they're there and they think they're there because they deserve it? Yeah.
Very interesting. Well, that wraps up part 2 of our discussion of religion in India. We'll see you next time.